Hello, hello. Hi. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome everyone. We're about to start today's panel on education. I'd just like to welcome everybody who's in attendance today and give thanks that we're able to have a day hopefully as powerful as this, and that we can make some very powerful conversations, but not just conversations, also practical developments in the struggle for reparations and reparatory justice. So I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Oli Harrisson. I work at LSE and I'm a scholar activist as part of INASAR. I'd also like to introduce everyone else on the panel today. So I'm joined by Lisa Anderson, the Managing Director of the Black Cultural Archives, next to me here on the right. We're also joined by Dr. Nicola Frith, Senior Lecturer in French and Francophone Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Lamaya Sherae, CEO of Enact Equality. Miles Greenwood, Lead Curator of the Transatlantic Slavery and Legacies at the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. And also Councillor Graham Campbell of the SNP, the first African Caribbean elected to council in Scotland. So I'd just like to give a brief introduction before we get to the panel about education in the context of reparations and reparatory justice. I think everyone in this room recognizes that the education system, or rather miseducation system in this country, is absolutely inadequate to tackle questions of reparations and reparatory justice. The schools, higher education systems in this country are absolutely incapable of dealing with questions of cognitive justice, reparatory justice, and environmental justice, all questions which need to be answered by our reparation struggle. So education in the broadest context, in the broadest sense of, hello, is this, I think this is better. Education in the broadest sense of the concept is one that really extends far beyond schools, universities, because these systems have proven for not just decades but centuries that they are entirely opposed to the freedom and liberation of African peoples. That they teach children in this country to not know themselves, particularly those who come from African heritage communities. We are not taught who we are not taught about our history, our struggles, our ancestors, and the context or the historical reasoning for the situations that we're in today. We also have to recognize that education is not just something that's limited to the period of childhood. It's a lifelong learning process. And we're unable to revolutionize education for our young generations if education does not also incorporate those who are teaching them and our older generations. So we have to think about a revolutionary and radical approach to education, one that is incredibly different from the institutional programs that we have currently, and raise the question of not just what content is we are taught, but how we learn and how we educate to resolve the struggles that we're currently facing. So I think, as you'll see behind me, this large banner, that education has to start with a recognition that African peoples have and are going through an African genocide, the Mangamese. And it is an absolute necessity to reform our education system and our own institutions around this concept, because we cannot hope to challenge an African Holocaust if the institutions which we are taught in do not recognize this in the first place. So in the context of African communities in the UK, we live in a country that not only built its current wealth from the African Holocaust and exploitation of African masses, but continues to do so. The gears of this economy run on the blood of Africans living today, not just in the UK, but in the continent, in the Caribbean, and throughout the diaspora. So we have to recognize that education is the foundation of our struggle for reparations and the ultimate Pan-African liberation of our peoples. We're here today to engage in a struggle to bring forth the contradictions and try and harmonize an actual revolutionary and radical approach to education. So I'd like to start with a general question to the panel, and we can take a few minutes each to answer. So what are the Pan-African reparatory justice imperatives of education? Let's start with Lisa.
Can you repeat the question, please?
So what are the Pan-African reparatory justice imperatives of education?
I say that the imperative is for us to know ourselves and to know our history in order to be able to move forth towards a situation of equity. And those are the very foundations that Black Cultural Archives is based upon. I think many people here, I mean, it's here in the presentation that I prepared. I don't know whether we'll get a chance to share those words.
Yeah.
I prepared something about 5 minutes long to spare. Can I just go into that now, or? Okay. I want to start by saying that, well, thank you, and it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be the director of Black Cultural Archives. We see ourselves as the home of Black British history. We are a Black-led, Brixton-based, independent charity rooted in over 40 years of educational activism. Our extensive, rich, and unique collections of historical documents, coupled with our educational workshops, exhibitions, and events, make us a beacon for Black history and education at home and abroad. From heritage seekers to future leaders, from school children and young people to academics and elders, we serve all people who seek a deeper, more inclusive understanding of British and world history. Why? Because we believe that by fulfilling our mission to collect, preserve, and celebrate the histories of people of African and African Caribbean descent, we can support the pursuit of racial justice and equity by not only inspiring, but by giving strength to individuals, community, and society. So this panel and me presenting here gives us the opportunity to center Black Cultural Archives as an organization that has maintained a commitment to using education as a tool for reparatory justice from its inception in the 1980s until the present day. As an organization, we want to be understood as a player and partner in the ongoing pursuit of reparatory justice. Historical context. BSA stems from the convergence of three key factors: the aftermath of the Black community uprisings of 1981, the influence of Queen Mother More's visit to London, where she encouraged the development of monuments that could be a comprehensive international depository of African life and culture, and a meeting place where we could develop the strategies and resources needed to continue the struggle for liberation. And our founder, Len Garrison, and all the people who he collaborated with, their commitment and focus on educational activism through the work of organizations like ACER, the African Caribbean Education Resource. As we know, one of the catalysts for the uprisings across Britain in the 1980s was the poor educational attainment and lack of jobs prospects for Black youths, highlighted by Bernard Cord's work almost a decade earlier. One of the solutions identified by the community was to continue focusing on education as a catalyst for change. The desire to form BCA was discussed not only in terms of creating a physical monument to Black history within Britain, but also to provide educational resources to promote positive self-image and to increase pride and historical awareness within the community to continue the work of ACER. So where is Black Cultural Archives now? Well, our current programmatic work is split into three interconnected themes. First, collect and activate. Second, educate and inspire. 3, celebrate and champion. Our collect and activate work speaks to how we develop, manage, and activate our unique collections for research, as well as ongoing knowledge and culture production. Educate and inspire speaks to how we use our archives, these unique collections, as a basis for our learning and skills development services for all ages. Celebrate and champion speaks to how we bring these histories to life through exhibitions, events, and thought leadership. Our unique learning approach gives learners a deeper insight into what and how the past shapes our present and our future. Over the last month, for Black History Month, it's been a delight to welcome over 60 young children almost a day into our building alongside readers as our core audiences. Finish. Our program of school workshops give pupils an opportunity to access our collections stored at the Black Cultural Archives. And these are treasures that are inspiring. I'm going to hurry up because I want my other panelists to have due time to speak. But the collections include information on the uprisings, the history of Black British feminism, Windrush journeys, John Canoe Masquerade, Black abolitionists in Georgian London, change makers in Victorian Britain, amongst other subjects. As well as providing educational workshops to uplift and inspire, we directly support PhD candidates to contribute to the expanding visibility and engagement with Black historical scholarship, which is key. And I'm sad to see that Dr. Hakeem Addy is not on this panel, but is a prime example of the importance of that scholarship. In addition to the work that we do to develop and provide access to that education, we're very much committed to the changing and transformation of our curriculum to make sure it's more inclusive. We have a couple of partnerships just to highlight. We've recently developed a 5-year partnership with Royal Holloway University, and just early this summer, we had interns going through our collections to identify information that could be added to the curriculum to be able to advocate for that change. We've also had, now going on for 5+ years, a partnership with King's University, where we have a joint module called Black in Union Jack, which provides those scholars with access to our archives and to in-depth conversation about history related to the African diaspora more widely. In conclusion, we're having this conversation because little progress has been made since 2020, when my predecessor, Erike Oke, represented Black Cultural Archives' position in response to the toxicity of Kemi Badenoch's statements. The statement remains as true as ever. She said, "We will not be able to learn from our past without knowing our past, and so we advise, hope for, and demand that teachers are given clear guidance, robust resources, and meaningful support to be able to include all of Britain's history into the classroom for the benefit of future generations." I'll just go forwards to my final point. Like I said at the beginning, we want to be seen as a player and partner with all you activists, all organizations that are in pursuit of reparatory justice from an educational perspective. We stand alongside all the panelists here, and some who are not, who play an essential role in alternative education and skills development, including the work of organizations like Decolonizing the Archive, and importantly, Black Curriculum. We have Lavinia Sennett, who was a fabulous advocate for change, not only in the delivery of education, but also in the campaigning for curriculum change, who's sitting down. Hopefully she will share some of her views in the Q&A. We recognize that transforming the situation requires a coalition of support, and BCA wants to be core to convening and supporting this effort. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. The same question to Nikki, or more broadly to the panel if people want to jump in, just because I'm aware we're pressed for time. The reparatory imperatives, the imperatives of reparatory justice in education, if anybody wants to step forward. Or, yeah, sure.
I'm going to start by saying Scotland's a country, but it's a perpetrator country. And as a perpetrator nation, it has to address its role in slavery. And I say that as a representative of my city, which last year apologized for its role in the slave trade. But the apology is the first step. The next steps are the more difficult ones. And I'll address some of that, because part of the necessary correcting of the historical narrative is one of the reasons why we have to change the curriculum of what our children are taught. And not just African children, I mean Scottish children. They need to learn that Africa is a civilized place. It's the source of civilization. So it's not just a matter of correcting the pro-slavery narrative. It's actually correcting their whole mindset about what African civilization and culture is. And therefore, when the Europeans catch up, when Europeans get civilization, That's what they need to learn in the schools. Now, we're a long way from that. I'm not going to pretend that we're anywhere close to that, but what we are at least some part of the way towards is a correcting of the incorrect historical narrative about Scotland's role in slavery. The number of historians now have published some really good work, and it's those historians we've relied on to try and correct that narrative, begin that process. So we start with a correct and accurate narrative. The next thing is co-curating what we think a curriculum should be. So when we started our reparative justice journey, it started with Flag Up asking Glasgow University to do a report. That snowballed into the relationship between them and the University of the West Indies in 2018, now the Beniba Centre for Slavery Studies. The city doing the same, commissioning a report and then issuing the apology, but then making some concrete proposals around street names, statues, legacy, and having it visibly represented so you could see what Glasgow's role was. So that we are currently consulting. I'm actually leading a committee that's consulting the public on this right now. So we are actively engaging our community. Now, we started with engaging African Caribbean communities first, because we recognize, learning from Bristol and Liverpool's experiences, that we actually had to step back a bit, rather than just do just simply change the names and without any process of education, atonement, or awareness. That would have been the wrong thing to do. We could easily have just changed the names and nobody would have been any the wiser. We would not have had acknowledgement, not in the full sense of a full understanding of the whole society as to why we should change things. I have to say, my experience of the last 10 years has been that Glaswegians have actually been willing and open to listening to the question of slavery and reparative justice, because they said, well, why didn't I know about that in school? Why didn't I learn that in history? That's been the predominant reaction. That's, yeah, sure. Some minority of people have said, oh yeah, why are you dealing with this? Isn't the cost of living more important? You should be getting on with your job as a councillor and tidying my bins, all that sort of nonsense. You get that. But people do understand, and they are beginning to understand now in a really important way across Scotland, that the racism we have today has its origins in the racism of yesterday from the structured system of slavery that we had. Now, the Williams thesis, I'm talking about Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, that theory that racial capitalist patriarchy's origins are centrally based upon African enslavement. That is now accepted as mainstream discourse in Scotland. It's accepted in mainstream discourse in Scotland, in our parliament and in our city, that that's the basis of historical racism, and it's the basis of the institutional racism that we have now. So that's accepted, and we discussed that in parliament. I can't imagine that, you would have had, can you imagine the first prime minister in this country here having a Black History Month event in their own house in Downing Street, acknowledging slavery legacy, but the home of the First Minister, Bute House, is in fact got a slavery legacy to it. And the First Minister, Nicola at the time, hosted a Black History Month event in it. So our discussion on these questions generally is a bit further ahead in terms of hearing and atonement, and the discussion is begun. But I would say that it requires, for it to be a genuinely Pan-African process, we need to involve all the different African communities at all their different levels of understanding of this. Now, I'm going to give you a slight variation on this. I grew up in London. I've been in Scotland for 21 years. But it's the case that African Scottish people, most of them have come directly from Africa to Scotland. They haven't been mediated by the black liberation politics that we will have all grown up with down here. And therefore, their experience of white supremacy is very different to ours. It's been at arm's length at a neo-colonial level, and many of them are, frankly, middle-class, professionally educated people who've come to work in the oil industry in Scotland. So they simply haven't experienced the same things that many of us have experienced. So their relationship to this subject and to the history of it, I even have to convince some of them that it's relevant. I have to say to them, well, I want to fight racism and discrimination against Scottish people, Scottish African people. But to do that, I have to try and find a way of doing this through education. So I'm saying that as a first step. We have got a course, just to say finally, we have a course in reparatory justice at Glasgow University linked with the University of the West Indies. It's just started. It's the first degree of its kind. It's a joint degree, and it goes through the human rights, the reparative justice explanations of the law, and how do we, put on record that it's a crime against humanity historically. It was illegal in the past, it's illegal now, and it should be recognized that retrospective justice must apply. So these are the things you will learn on the course, and I hope that people will apply to do it. But that's all I can say in the time I have. So apologies, I can't say more.
Thank you, Councillor. To follow up on that specifically, is acknowledgement sufficient? Is it sufficient to have these reparatory justice courses run through institutions which intentionally miseducate our peoples? Can we trust these to be sufficient for our liberation struggles, for the Pan-Africanizing of reparations, particularly in the context of the SNP, your party? Resolving Scotland's relationship and direct participation in colonialism to the Scottish national question, how they frame their right to nationhood, but then is there clear support within the SNP for the African people's right to nationhood and to a Pan-African nation? And there are surely limitations which we must acknowledge through this particular process.
I really don't have proper time to do justice to that question without doing a seminar on Scotland and independence. But let's put it this way. Independence does throw up the question of what Scotland's national identity is. Down here, your problem is that Britain still thinks it's an empire and thinks it was justified in being one. Scots at least have a sense of criticism of that because they want to break from the UK state. But in doing so, they can't resolve themselves from all responsibility for what the British state did, because Scotland became great because of slavery and because of its role as a perpetrator. 15% of the people who claimed slavery compensation were Scots. We were overrepresented in it. Some of the most brutal, nasty, murderous, vicious rapists were Scots. So we have to own that. And by owning it, we can then have an honest assessment of how Africans and Europeans relate. Because I think that has to be where it starts from. Now, can you trust those institutions? Hell no. If you go to UWI doesn't, the Caribbean doesn't have free education at tertiary level. So one of the issues we have is access to these courses. Unless we answer some of those questions about access. Now, there are scholarships available for people of black, UK, African descent. So they can get scholarships to go to the Glasgow course. But I don't know what the situation is in the Caribbean. I don't think they have the same access. So this elite institution, which is actually based on a slave plantation, is going to have to address its role about access. Now, to do that, the Caribbean countries need reparations from Scotland and the UK so they can afford to give free education. So that's a task. So you can't trust these institutions, even if you're in them, and I'm in one. I have to battle away to make it accountable. But I need the help of my community and the backing of my community to do that.
Thank you. Question to Nikki. What are the obligations of scholars within higher education to demands for reparatory justice, particularly those of non-African heritage as well?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Great. So yeah, I'm Nikki Frith. I work at the University of Edinburgh. Thank you. So yeah, I work at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm a scholar of slavery and reparation, but I'm also one of the co-founders of INASAR, which stands for the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. And I'm also co-chair at the moment of the Research and Engagement Working Group that is looking into my own institution's legacies of slavery and colonialism. So I'm trying to think about the imperatives. You asked this question about the imperatives of reparation and how we are positioned. I did have a presentation plan, so I'll kind of move around that a little bit. But I mean, one of the things, I think there's lots of universities that are now involved in writing these reviews for looking at their legacies, particularly of slavery. And what we found is there are particular ways that is approached. So, for example, typically what you have is scholars who are coming in who are usually at postgrad level, and they are employed for 6 months, a year, maybe 2, and then they leave. Now, that's really problematic for any kind of succession. Like, how can you plan anything? You have a review that looks at the financial links, then the person who was employed to do that goes. So who is sustaining that narrative afterwards and placing pressure on the institution? And the other problem is you often find there's not a lot of community engagement in these processes right from the beginning. Like, how can you, when we set up the INASAR, for example, the reason we set that up is because I'd organised a reparations conference in 2015 at the University of Edinburgh, and it was Parco who contacted me to say, look, you can't do this. Yes, you've made space for activists to come, but you haven't enabled them to come here through, paying for transportation or whatever. And I've got a quote here from what they said, but it was talking about these asymmetrical power relations that are involved whenever academics operating within elite institutions engage with reparations. So when we're thinking about, like, how do I personally position myself, or how do I conduct my work, well, I can't do it unless there are communities of reparatory justice interest working right from the beginning in shaping that process and its outcomes. And some of the things I've just been observing among the many institutions that are now involved in this is how those institutions suddenly come to decisions about what they're going to do to respond to the financial, what a surprise, discovery that they're linked to the history of slavery. I think that focus on economic history has a tendency to then financialize the answer as well. But, you know, there's no way that universities were just involved financially in the legacies of slavery and colonialism. They were involved in a whole system, a systemic process of knowledge production between the colonies, the plantations, and back to the university, producing colonizers, producing enslavers. That's the circle that we're trying to unpick in Edinburgh. I could talk more about what we're trying to do, but I want to give room. But I just want to point out, these are the questions that I had about the work that other institutions are doing to date. How do these institutions arrive at the decisions that this is what reparatory justice equals? What role do communities of reparatory justice interest play in shaping those outcomes, if at all? And to what extent do these decisions actually benefit those who continue to live with the legacies of slavery or colonialism, or are they simply designed to support and rebrand the university? Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Nikki. Question to Lamaya. In Pan-Africanizing our approach to education, how do we go about challenging Afrophobia? And what are the limitations in doing this through institutions and institutional work with say, the government or local authorities?
Thank you. Okay, cool. So I'm Sherae. I run an organization called Enact, which is essentially an organization that runs national campaigns for racial justice, with an aim to change laws and policies to better protect black communities across the UK. So I'm sure some of you have probably heard of Marcus Rashford, the footballer. We were involved in his free school meals campaign that extended free school meals for children across England. You may have also seen on the news the Afro hair discrimination campaign around the fact that black children, over 50% of black children, are sent home from school as a result of having Afro hair, or as a result of having their hair in protective hairstyles like braids, dreadlocks, twists, cane rows, and so on. So we ran a national campaign on that, which led to the Prime Minister's office changing education policy guidance across England, Scotland, and Wales to basically help prohibit Afro hair discrimination in schools. So in answer to your question, I think one of the key approaches is really to look at how policies can be transformed to actually affect the well-being and safeguarding of black children across the UK. I think that's fundamental, and that's the reason as to why my organization has a specific focus on changing laws and changing policy specifically. But in addition to this, I'm really glad that a lot of the panelists have mentioned the curriculum, black representation in the curriculum specifically. But I think what's also fundamental is that we see more black teachers in our schools as well. Over 50% of schools across the UK have no black or Asian teachers whatsoever. I mean, what kind of representation is that for our children? And not only does that affect kind of symbolic representation in terms of the role models that we see in our classrooms, but I think it has a direct impact upon the proliferation of racism that we see in our classrooms today. So when we think about school exclusions, I mean, I'm from a Caribbean background myself, and black Caribbean boys in particular are up to 6 times more likely to get excluded from schools. And in regards to black Caribbean girls, they're more likely to get excluded, not just because of racism from peers and teachers, but also because of unaddressed sexual harassment in classrooms. And that's often kind of completely missed in the media. And lastly, we recently ran a campaign around county lines and drug selling. And what we found was that in schools which are supposed to safeguard our children, black boys in particular are often seen as perpetrators rather than victims, even though they're under the age of 16 and they're groomed into county lines and criminal exploitation, whereas white children are often seen as the victims of grooming, but black boys very rarely are. So I think tackling all of these issues from a policy perspective in schools is key, because safeguarding children should be fundamental to any educational institution in the UK. And I think lastly, what I would love to see, I mean, this is very optimistic, but I would love to see an increase in black scholarships for not only black children, but also black adults. I think we have to think of learning and education as a real kind of holistic necessity in our society. And when we consider the fact that for hundreds of years, black people were even prohibited from learning to read and write, I think the very least we can ask for or demand for is free education for our children. And I think if anything, that is key. We're seeing more of that kind of through different celebs that we work with, for example, like Stormzy and so on. But I think there should be an onus on governmental institutions to actually do more to ensure that black children are not only protected, but are supported to achieve their full potential in our education system.
Okay, yeah, and then another question to Miles. Now, in some of your work, you've talked about museums as sort of a contested space. You work at the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. How do we go around transforming these museums which mark the Holocaust of African peoples into sites of resistance and not one of submission and defeat? Is this possible where these institutions are obviously directly linked and funded through governments which are still continuing the genocide? And does the executioner sign his own death warrant? What are the limitations of museums in this educational approach, this revolutionary educational approach?
Does this work? Can you hear me okay? Okay. That's a very big question. I mean, for me, I think a few people have touched on how we need to approach education in a very holistic way. There's not necessarily one way that people learn about the world and the past, and we have to consider in our societies what are those different ways that people learn about the world. And whether we like it or not, museums in the UK are spaces of public memory. They are spaces that shape how people understand our past and what it means to us today. And without naming names, some of those museums might try and present a very comfortable version of Britain's past that looks to glorify its role in global history. What I would say is that the International Slavery Museum, I don't know how well people know the International Slavery Museum. I sometimes come into spaces and assume that everyone knows what I'm talking about. But to give a little bit of background, the International Slavery Museum is based in Liverpool. It opened in 2007 and is still Britain's only dedicated museum to engaging people with the history and legacies of transatlantic slavery. And it exists as a floor within a building of another museum, which you could consider an injustice in its own right, that a museum that represents such a history that we know is incredibly significant occupies just one floor. But I won't go into that too much because I know I have limited time and a big question to address. But I do think that the International Slavery Museum tries to engage people with conversations around reparations, and I think there's a few ways that it tries to do that. One of which is, if you go into the museum, one of the first galleries that you'll come across presents collections that speak to the diversity and richness of African cultures, and I know that a few people have spoken about this as an important beginning. That is not without problem, because we could ask the question as to where those collections come from and whether they should be in the museum in the first place. But I think the intent is important to sort of ground this history in an understanding that Africa has had rich and creative cultures before transatlantic slavery. And I think then the museum tries to engage people with the realities of transatlantic slavery. So the violence of that history. We have objects such as shackles and objects such as plantation ledgers where people are named and the value of their bodies is listed next to those names. And then we also try to engage people with the legacies of this history, so the racism, the global inequalities. But all of that work can be improved, and I know you asked the question about how we can engage people with narratives of resistance, ways that we can empower people as well and make people feel a sense of pride in their ancestry. And I think that the way we do that is by connecting this history with human beings and people today, and recognizing that these objects are very important. These objects are evidence as to the atrocities committed as part of transatlantic slavery. You might visit this museum and you might disagree with my interpretation of these collections, but you can't deny the cold, hard iron of shackles or the weight that they bear. It is just very much a reality of this history. But the way that we interpret them can reframe them in different ways as well. Like when it comes to stay with the example of shackles, to remember that these were items that were forged in places like Birmingham in the UK, transported to port cities like Liverpool, and brought to the west coast of Africa to be forced by one human being onto another. But with that, it's important to remember that you don't force shackles onto a human being who doesn't resist. And I think that's something that can sometimes be lost in the understanding that the people who there was an attempted dehumanization against never stopped resisting at any phase in this, and they did that sometimes in small or large ways. And I would accept that the International Slavery Museum can improve the way that it presents that, and we will definitely look to do so as we look to redevelop the museum in the coming years. But I think another point to your question was asking about museums more broadly as well, and the International Slave Museum is just but one museum, and I think a lot of the people who come through its doors come with an element of intent in the first place. You know in the name that you are visiting a museum where you're going to explore the histories of slavery, whereas people who are perhaps visiting other museums up and down the UK aren't looking to engage with that history, but it's very much relevant to those museums as well. There are many of these museums whose collections and money is founded on the basis of transatlantic slavery, and a lot of those collections have come through the subsequent colonization of places around the world. And I think that it's important that those museums are also engaging in this dialogue as well, because whether we like it or not, or whether we agree that these institutions are places where people should be learning about the past, the reality is that people do. People's consciousnesses are shaped by these institutions, and if we're able to change the way that we present these histories in those spaces, I do think it will have a significant impact.
Thank you, Miles. Before we open up to questions from the floor, I just want to introduce Malik Nasir, a current PhD student in history at the University of Cambridge, who I believe is joining by Zoom.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. So just a quick question on, we'll return to the original question. So the Pan-African imperatives for education, what are they and how do you see them working out?
Well, I concur with much of what's been said on the panel today, particularly what Graham Campbell was saying, and my colleague Sherae, who I do quite a lot of work with as well, that it's a question of the curriculum. It starts with the curriculum. When I was a kid in school, the story of Little Black Sambo in the Jungle was played in the school assemblies. It was the campaigner and activist Dorothy Kuya coming to our schools to try and get, those books and 10 Little Nigger Boys, the Proud Gollywog, to get them off the curriculum. And there was this feeling at the time that white people had the right to be racist. It was just their sort of God-given right based upon the historical anomalies that led to the kind of racist ideology that we have today. So what I've been doing, and I've been working closely with Sherae, Dr. Leona Vaughan at the University of Liverpool and others, is looking at the issue of what are the barriers to black academia. So, the school exclusions that Lamaya was alluding to, much of that is also rooted in the fact of how black people feel in white schools. We are made to feel like we don't belong there. We're given a curriculum that doesn't relate to us, or it shows us in such a negative light that we don't even feel like that we want to be there. So there's a whole range of factors that play into this, not least of which the racism historically of the institutions itself, but the curriculum materials. Now, in order to change those curriculum materials, we have to have the research into the history of what happened during the period of enslavement and colonialism, and for that we need to decolonize the archives. Now, for too long, you know, the white British establishment has decided that these things need to be buried in the archives and never come out. It's this dark history that they don't want people to know. And as a consequence of that, they are the gatekeepers of much of this history. They forbid us to read and write. They took away our rights to literacy and numeracy and all of the other things that we had in abundance before they came to Africa to take us and steal us and bring us to, you know, their colonies. And as a consequence of that, they left us in a state of high levels of illiteracy, low levels of attainment, and also, you know, these just innumerable intersectional disadvantages that would preclude us from being able to survive in their world. And since they've now sort of taken over our world, they've left us in a situation where if you can't survive in their world, you'll just be sidelined in society. And that has happened, and in order for us to be able to address those barriers, we need to find ways to look at the historical origins of them and what we can do to lift them. So myself and Lamaya have been working on the development of some policy documents called Lifting the Barriers to Black Academia. It started with a series of symposia that we did with black academics across the Atlantic world, including Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who is from the CARICOM Reparations Commission at the University of the West Indies, and many other academics in America, the Caribbean, and the UK, to see from our own perspective what are the barriers that we faced and what we could do then, working with policymakers at a statutory level, at an institutional level, and a policy level, to change those things and to lift those barriers. And part of that is about positive action initiatives that will ring-fence funds for black academics. If you look at the professoriate, you see the case from what Hakeem Addy went through recently. There is hardly any black professors in the UK, and we found that only 0.4% of all of the public money that went into funding postgraduate research was actually given to black British and black Caribbean academics. That has to stop. The conditions that were being placed upon that funding, which is public money, there is a public duty here. You know, this money is being distributed to elite universities using criteria that many black people just couldn't meet. You have to have a first-class honours degree, a master's with distinction, otherwise you're not going to get the funding. If you don't get the funding, you can't do the research. If you don't do the research, you can't do the peer-reviewed documents and produce the academic monographs that would form the basis of the curriculum materials that people would study in the universities. So it's a whole link of things which needs to be unpicked at every stage. And our policy document provides a whole range of recommendations on what can be done at an institutional level. This is higher education institutions throughout the UK. At a policy level within the existing policy framework that is there right now, and also at a statutory level. And Lamaya has worked with the people in the House of Parliament.
Malik,
actually,
thank you. I'm going to have to cut you off because that's we've just got a little bit over time.
If I can just finish, just to develop a bill called a Widening Access and Participation Bill, and we would ask people to support that bill when it goes through, and Lamaya will be able to give you more details about that.
Okay, thank you, Malik. Okay, so before we open this up to questions from the floor, I think there's just a couple of points maybe we should clarify. Is that this is a panel today about education, and I'm very aware that it is not an educational process if it's just the 5 or 6 of us sat up here speaking to you and there is no engagement. The questions that are forthcoming, I'm hoping that you critically engage with us, because this is an educational process. We're here to learn together and harmonize our perspectives. Secondly, I think what's become very apparent from the responses on the panel today is this question around curriculum and institutions. Now, I'm very aware, and I include myself in this, that we are all, everyone on this panel, part of some institution, and there is perhaps a vested interest in maintaining our Pan-African struggle through these institutions, right? Now, I don't know about anyone in this room, but the esteemed gentleman before the talk was talking very passionately that reparations is not something that you ask for, that is given. It's something that you take. So I think we have to keep in mind that reparations is not something that we're asking for these institutions to provide us. A reparatory approach to education is not something that we are asking for. It's something that we must take and create ourselves. and that there must be a need to build our own institutions and shift away from a handful of people who are funneling resources and time and energies into institutional work, whether that be through higher education or governmental involvement. And then finally, to also clarify that our approach to reparations is not something financial. There is no blood money does not resolve the issue of the Mangamizi. I mean, we're sat up here. We have flags and banners of our freedom fighters. We're sat in front of this banner which explicitly says liberty or death, right? Our educational approach has to be able to answer this question. It's not one that can continue to stay in these institutions which have actively contributed towards the death and killing of our peoples. And that we need to work together to really build a new approach to education. And it can't just keep going within the same circles that it has been for decades and decades. So I would like to open up questions to the floor. And we'll start at the back, just there, in the blue.
Can you wait for a mic to come to you?
Thank you. Hello, I'll start again. My name is Paul Phoenix. I'm from LondonVibes.com, which is London Vibes spelled VYBES, LondonVibes.com. I want to give you a little piece of reality. Starting back from the first reparations conference that was had many, many years ago with the late and great Bernie Grant and Linda Bellows. We were there. Well, I was there along with some friends. And one of the reasons why we went to Birmingham was to protect Bernie Grant from threats made by the National Front when he was getting the train from Paddington. Their statement was he might get on at Paddington, but he's not going to arrive. And our statement was, let's see, he will arrive in one piece. And a lot of issues happened, you know. But the thing is, we protected Bernie Grant up there. And when he arrived in Birmingham, the council employees made the point of playing the music downstairs very, very loud to disrupt the meeting that was being held.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can we get to the question just because we're pressed for time?
We are getting to the question, but I cannot ask you a question unless I give you some background information. Secondly, a reality. I was involved in working with parents and children over the many years. The parents, the children were excluded from school for all kinds of reasons. We work with a lot of those children, much to the annoyance of the education welfare officers in various councils, Lewisham being one of them. And there was a lot of hassle with the education authorities. They called the police and they got the social services involved. What I'm trying to say is what you're saying to me right now literally sums up the statement was the operation was a success, but the patient died. I think you have to become more acquainted with the reality of what racism is actually doing to the people in our community. It is not something that is not a philosophical statement. Racism kills. Racism forces parents to ignore their children. It forces young children who could be the geniuses and leaders of tomorrow to leave school, to end up on the street. That is what racism does. So when you talk about the
Sir, please, can we get to the question? We'll have to move on. We don't have enough time.
Okay.
Yeah.
No kidding. Well, tell me something. I hadn't really noticed that. Right. My question is, what are you doing practically to address the issue of racism within the educational system, which really and truly is the bedrock of racism? What are you actually doing practically to address that? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. What we'll do, we'll take a couple of questions and then we'll answer them all in one go. Shan, at the top of the stairs, please. Lots of people have their hands up. You'll get your question, please.
From all that we've heard, apart from, I think to some extent, Nikki, I've not heard anything about the actual Pan-African liberation struggle going on now, how all of you relate to it. Because, you seem to talk as if our struggle is in the past. Mm-hmm. And we need to be educated about our past. But the actual struggle going on at present, over controlling our resources, taking back our land, dismantling borders, right? And bringing dignity in and outside of the classrooms and lecture halls to our people. None of you have spoken about that. Apart from Nikki touching on the issue about communities of reparatory justice interest. And that is what I would like what is the relationship of you all and the work that you're doing to the actual struggles of our people right now, which lives are being lost, and the threats of white supremacy, racist fascism is increasing. And in that sense, the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, where I live, what is your connection to the actual struggles of our community of resistance in Brixton right now in terms of confronting the Mangamizi, right? And then lastly, on that score, what are the lessons you are drawing from the experiences that abound here? Achaba Adai-Sebo is here. During his time, schools in London were teaching about the liberation struggles being waged at the time by Frelimo, PAIGC, ANC, and so on, and taking that into anti-racist education in the classroom. That is missing today. What are you doing about that?
Thank you. Do we have any immediate responses to that question? Because I think that's absolutely valid, right? Is that we can't treat education purely as a historical and intellectual curiosity. These things are continuing. Our peoples are still losing lives and being killed to continue this exploitative machine. So what are we doing? And I think that goes to everyone on the panel, but also within this room. How can we go to harmonize a new approach and building new institutions for our own education to actively end these? Excuse me, could we wait? We're taking questions in a row.
You're making statements.
Excuse me, please can we listen to the leadership of the convener?
We're answering questions in groups, and you'll get a chance to ask your question, but please be patient. So if the panel could respond to those first two questions.
No, can you wait for
Can you wait until you're called upon? Can you wait until you're called upon, please, and sit down? Thank you. Could the panel please respond to those first two questions?
Okay. I'm going to start by saying this. I've known Kofi for getting on for 30 years, so I know where he's coming from on this question. My father was a colleague of Bernie Grant's, and he's still there in Tottenham. He's 86 years old, and he was on strike with Bernie in the early 70s. So this is something I've had for a long time in my life as a Pan-Africanist. So I start from that premise. Now, we weren't asked to talk about the Pan-African struggles, so I think it's really unfair for my brother over there to ask me a question he knows I don't have time to fully elucidate on, and which I wasn't asked to speak on. I was asked to speak about education, so I will answer Paul's question, because I think that's a legitimate question for me as an education convener. I'm actually the chair of the education committee in Glasgow, so I can say what I've done. As an activist, I'm also involved with parents campaign against racism, although our problems are slightly different to the way Lamaya laid it out, because our problem is to do with how they treat racial incidents in schools. So I've been part of a campaign called Campaign Against Racism in Education in Scotland, and we've had a number of problems amongst a number of local authorities, which I've worked with, and since becoming convener, I've made sure that these racial incidents are properly reported, properly looked into, that the teachers are getting racial literacy education led by black educators. I've doubled the number of black educators in the workforce in the 4 years I've been on the committee and the 1 year since I've been chair. It's not enough yet. We still need more black teachers. The problem we have is more around, not around exclusions. It's actually black kids in Scottish schools actually do better than the average. Exclusions are very, very low in Glasgow. So we have a policy of nurture, which means that it's not our main problem. Our main problem is how do we deal with the discriminatory behavior of other children and of teachers? How do we address those? We have to educate educators. So that's the processes I've been involved in. Around the history curriculum, we just introduced last year curriculum adjustments around the slavery legacy from a Scottish perspective, because if you learn slavery history in schools at the moment, most of it talks about London, Bristol, doesn't talk about Glasgow. So we've added stuff about Glasgow. So 14-year-olds now can look at that in history. We're also looking at primary school education as well. So we're in that process of adjusting the primary and secondary education right now. South Africa, by the way, the whole liberation struggle of South Africa and how Scotland played a role in that. You know, Nelson Mandela came to Glasgow for a reason, because Scots were very, very involved in that campaign, and our solidarity with it was important to the history of the city. So that's a curriculum that 14-year-olds now learn what the struggle of apartheid was and how Scots were involved in it. So that's something they do learn in school. I'm not saying it's enough, because of course it's not, but I'm saying within the limits that curriculum and counsellors and what we can do, these are the things I have done. Now, our own involvement is widespread, and I can't really go into it here, but safe to say, I hate racial capitalist patriarchy. I'm not content to live with it. I have a job which puts me in a system which obviously forces me to take certain actions within that structure. But I'm very aware that that structure is not for us. It is enemy territory. And therefore, when we're in enemy territory, we have to have strategies which get out of those things that are in our interests. And some of that is to almost limit the damage that system does to our children. Sometimes your presence there does stop further damage being done. And I'm proud of the fact that I've done that. I've stopped racist incidents. I've got perpetrators kicked out of places. I've managed to do that. It's important that we have people who defend our interests in those structures. So that's what I do.
Okay, we're going to take 3 questions. Woman in the purple, and then you, and then... Yeah.
Right. The question that I want to ask, and I'll allude to why I'm going to ask the question. As somebody that's into education, I'm an English lecturer in a further education college. I think this conference is a teachable moment, really, to help us to move forward and really prepare our learners. And because I teach adult learners, what I found even in my sort of approach with black history and inclusive history, because I don't really think that's been included in these discourse, is that learners that are adults also want to know their history. Because they've been put in a survival mode of being on a financial treadmill, the powers that be are sort of rolling back the way that you can embed black history and inclusive histories into college presentation. I think my question here is not only what are you going to do to make sure that that momentum of rolling back with the current political structure, with people saying that you shouldn't encourage wokeness. Are we, as educators, are we supposed to keep our learners asleep and not be aware? Because if they're not aware, they don't understand why reparations is important, why our history before slavery is important. They're not going to be aware of why certain people are shouting louder about racism and other people are sort of being, playing a part in keeping everybody muted about what's happening to black people. And I think I have to agree with some of the comments already made in terms of the racism that's going on now is more insidious than I think than what was happening during the 50s on before. Because I can see in the learners that I come across, the adult learners, that when they come across something that empowers them and affirms them, and then they see that there's a structure that's also trying to mute them, it's like a sort of tug-of-war. And you have to be like almost superhuman nowadays to be a teacher, to educate your learners. My question here is what effective tools can be given to teachers like me to stop the rollback, but also to maintain the well-being and the belongingness of their learners.
Okay, thank you. And can we just try and keep the questions concise?
Oh, surprised, it said to me.
What?
Interesting. Greetings, conference. I just want to say a few words, and then I'll ask the question. I met Bernie Grant in 1996, which is why I'm a reparations activist. I'm very much aware of who's organised this conference, and I'm very much aware that there are people that are not here that need to know about reparations because they have a Pan-African perspective. The workshop, Education Preparation for Reparations. Many of us, prior to being here, have been involved in reparations. And as I've said, they have a different view as to who organised this conference, which is why they're not here. All I want to say is this, given that other people have said lengthy speeches, I'm aware other people want to speak, and I'm very much aware of who I am and what I've got to say, why I'm here now. One of the greatest African leaders reminded us of the importance of education. Marcus Messiah Garvey said, "A people without the true knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." The Windrush generation received a post-colonial or a colonialist education. We, as children of the Windrush generation, also received a colonialist education. We therefore have to take responsibility when we leave here today, not to depend on the all-party Parliamentary group or whatever it's called for African reparations. We have to pick up those books that were written and do it for ourselves. So no, I don't have a question, but I do have a contribution, and I've made it. The final thing I will say, is that I'm giving...
Let her finish, let her finish.
Let me finish. They said let me finish.
I'm not in control of the microphone.
So the final point that I have, I'll go by the conference, thank you brothers and sisters, is this. Reparations, what does that mean in theory and practice? I'm giving an hour-and-a-half presentation where you will also be invited to contribute. Marcus Garvey Library, 28th of October, next Saturday, free tickets on Eventbrite, 3 to 4:30. Thank you for listening.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So, my name is Lavinia.
People.
I'm the founder of the Black Curriculum, which is an organisation that teaches Black history in schools. We've been doing this for 4 years. It's a grassroots movement. We started with no government backing, and we still are operating today. My question is, what does a practical reparations curriculum look like? To me, this conversation is redundant without actually including, if you're talking about reparations, we're talking about coalition building. Not one invite was sent to my team. I'm not talking about me, it's not a vanity project. What I want to see is that there is actually the walk behind the talk. I think at the moment what I'm not seeing and what I'm not hearing from this panel is the practical solutions to building a reparatory curriculum. We've devised the curriculum, it's gone into schools, we've worked in Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, London, and we have that experience. And I think that if we were included in this conversation, we could have actually advised on the pitfalls, what teachers have gone through, what steps we need to actually take together to move forward. And if we can't start here, then there's no future
Sure.
for
Okay.
that. So
Yeah,
my question, I've already asked it. What does a practical curriculum look like?
Okay, well, I'll try and respond to some of that. First of all, I'm not involved in who gets an invite, so I don't know about that. But in terms of your question on curriculum, do you think that it's viable to introduce a truly reparatory curriculum in a system that is Afrophobic, that is encouraging and perpetrating genocide against our peoples? Why would one of those systems adopt a curriculum that truly serves our interests? Do we not have to build our own institutions and our own curriculums independently of the current institutions which are miseducating our people? This is an undeniable fact, right? So when we're talking about coalition building, and you're correct, and curriculum design, absolutely, but this has to happen on our own basis, from our own communities. I'm not asking this to be implemented by this school or that school that already exists, that is serving like a white supremacist system, and this genocidal project. We have to build independently, right? So I don't know if anybody else from the panel wants to respond to that question or the initial question on adult learners. I don't have a microphone.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like somebody raised earlier, like practical, what can we practically do? Like somebody raised earlier the issue of the archives. Like the archives within institutions are in disarray. Like no money has been put in to even sort out like the archival history of institutions. So even finding out the information of what institutions, how they've been implicated, is really difficult. But an equally important thing is there are no archives right now for this movement that's going on. They're sitting in Sister Esther Stanford-Cose's house right now, and we're trying to get funding, because how can you build a reparations curriculum without understanding the UK-based contingency of the international social movement for African reparations? So these are the kind of things, if we want to build a curriculum, we have to have archives on which, and works and things like that to refer to as well within that curriculum. I just wanted to say that. So we're trying to get funding at the moment to try and do that, just to say that is one practical response that we have.
Yeah, can I just quickly come in? I also think that how people envisage Pan-African liberation will differ depending upon your own background and your own community, also your age as well. I think that having a joined-up approach, firstly, is obviously key. But, for example, the conversations around the redistribution of wealth, building our own institutions, it takes capital, right? In reality, 50% of black households are in poverty in the UK. So if we're talking about redistributing wealth, where is this wealth coming from? We're talking about taking reparations. How do we take reparations from a majority white population? I understand the vision. I think it's crucial that we do build our institutions, but then access to finance has to be the key methodology to do that. We don't build our own institutions with no financial capital. And secondly, I think there are transitions with this, right? So especially in my generation, between, I suppose, the ages of 18 and 35, we're seeing people like Lewis Hamilton, for example, who's built Mission 44, which is a company to redistribute wealth amongst black communities, to create policies. I mean, I don't know how much it's done so far. All we can do is be optimistic, but we're seeing other organizations like Black Equity Organization, again, an institution to redistribute wealth amongst black communities. These have only been built within the past 5 years, right? So obviously, all we can do is try and be optimistic. But I think that it's crucial that we discuss access to capital, because if not, then these visions that we have about Pan-African liberation, creating our own institutions or creating mechanisms so that we can build an infrastructure that better safeguards our children are not able to actually become into fruition. I mean, these are conversations that have been had for many, many years, but the access to financial capital hasn't really changed drastically. The fact of the matter is that the vast majority of black populations in the UK are in poverty or are below the poverty line. So I think, again, these are crucial conversations if we're talking about having a truly independent education system that better safeguards black children.
Okay. Let's just take 2 questions from the front really quickly. And if we could keep them concise, please.
I'll get straight to the point. I apologize for my elders. How do we maintain an education reform that relates to the Pan-African struggle that is legitimate and broadens our struggles away from just our diasporic position in the UK and concretizes the Pan-African link with the African continent and indigenous knowledge systems of Abya Yala and beyond? And I also feel like Lavinia's question hasn't been fully answered, and I haven't heard from the Black Cultural Archives.
Yeah, happy to speak up. I'm very happy that you referenced the importance of the archives in order to chart forward effective advocacy campaigns. I think something that's missing here, and we're talking about coalition building, is recognizing that one organization can't do everything. Black Cultural Archives is an essential organization to steward the information around what has been done historically. It's a treasure trove of insights, strategies that have led to where we are today. It's important that it's properly catalogued, accessible, to empower the scholars we're talking about, to support the communities and the campaigners that we want to step alongside. That's our role. We're here to steward that information, make it accessible so it can be activated for progress. We are not necessarily the number one organization to do the campaigning. I want to work hand in hand with my colleagues beside me, hand in hand with Black Curriculum, who has done stellar work in designing curriculum. Black Cultural Archives, we have a collections team, we have an education team, we have a programs team. What we need to do is do that work effectively and do that in partnership with other organizations. My background, just that people don't necessarily know my credentials, is in international relations. I've got a master's in human rights. I've always been Pan-Africanist in my perspective personally. There's so much more that can be done to make space for those conversations about further strategies within Black Cultural Archives. We have a space. We're one of the organizations that do have space for that. I want us to be a key organization that convenes conversations about strategizing for equity and justice going forward. That's what we can practically do. And also where we can be a convener for attracting capital to work in partnerships with our colleagues. That is what, and I'm very pragmatic. I'm not going to try here and say that Black Cultural Archives has to be the answer to everything, but I want us to be much more strategic and intentional in working collaboration with the community. I've been in place, I mean, this is news. It was soon to be mentioned, but I am now the permanent managing director. I was interim managing director as of 21 December. So just give me a chance to extend my hand of partnership and collaboration to the colleagues who are on this panel today, because that's my intention for leadership.
I mean, I can bounce off that just because I think probably my context is a bit similar to Lisa's, in that I don't think that the International Slavery Museum is going to solve all the issues that we're talking about today. And to go back to Lavinia's question about practical solutions, I think it's important that we see some of these institutions as part of like an ecosystem of our education. And the way that I see the International Slavery Museum personally is that it's a potential resource for people who are wanting to learn about transatlantic slavery and its legacies. So when we recognize the limitations of the curriculum, when we recognize the limitations of other museums, you can go to places like the International Slavery Museum and the Black Cultural Archives, despite their limitations, and learn important parts of our history. And then you can take that forward in whichever way you see fit. So it's not to say that it's going to solve everything. I'm very pragmatic and I'm very honest about its limitations, but I do think it's a useful resource if you want to use it.
Okay, thank you. We are over time, but we'll carry on taking questions until the next audience comes, just in the front here, and then you're next one.
Mahat Otep. My belief is learning chair. You look like you're under pressure, but you do a good job. You have to remember that when you're dealing with our people, there's ancestral pain.
Yes.
Yeah? And our ancestors can only speak through us. So it's not a deliberate to disrespect what you're doing, but we have to express what our ancestors feel, because they can't speak for themselves, so we have to speak for them. Yeah? I'm part of an organization called Nubia African Community Foundation School. I was also co-chair of the African Emancipation Day Reparations March Committee 2015 to 2019. I'm also part of the management of one of the local radio stations that keeps our organizations and our people aware, galaxyafiwe.net. Yeah? I also have an African Master's PhD in the ghetto. I was schooled amongst my elders in the Pan-Africanist movement, amongst Rastafari. The question and statement I want to make is this. I don't want people globally or even in this room believing that we've been sitting down waiting for some funding. Our Saturday school has been running for 32 years. We are part of a unit of Saturday schools which include our Campbell and Revivalist Movement School of Excellence and Afrika Bantu Saturday School. They have both been running over 20 years. The chairs of our school are even the students that we taught that went and go through the schooling system, got their PhD like you, but decided to come back and give to the community. They run, in fact, one of our young prince is in here today. A Sherae is probably just gone out, he's recording. But he's one of the prodigies of one of those schools. So it's not like we're sitting down there waiting for, we've been doing stuff. Do you understand? And I don't want to get the impression that we're there beg nobody. You understand me? However, Black Archives, we're in Brixton. Afrika Bantu is in Brixton, yeah, and Nubia, we're in the same area, Lambeth. We're in Lambeth. Yeah, you understand? So what I'm saying is this. What visions do you have, or do you know of any schools like you up in Scotland? I want to know about you.
You sure about that?
I want to know about what kind of schools are you supporting that is totally African-based.
That isn't bad.
Yeah? I need to know that. And what I need to know is what you're doing about it.
I'm going about it.
Yeah, sort it out. I need to sort that out. However, I was a comedian in the next life. However, what plans do you have in supporting those? Because those, we've got a curriculum. Do you understand me? Exactly. And what happens is, we've seen with the few hours that we have our children on a Saturday, which is about 4 or 5 hours, the transmission that we can make them elevate to in only that period that we have them. But if we was to have them all strong, not weak, because we're not weak, all strong, what provisions, or have you got anything in there to say, well, boy, we need to open a school for African children, supported by African teachers, which in our school we call them Sebas, the ancient Kemetic word for it. Have you got any plans of that? Because some of what I keep hearing...
Do you want us to answer?
Yeah, 1 second, my queen. Melan. The last thing that I want to say, we have to change the language narrative. Now, we know about education. We got a lot of educated Africans. We do nothing for African people. We need African people who's Africated, who have Africation, who goes into these institutions of learning, acquire like you have done, my queen, this knowledge, and then come and give back. Those are Africated Africans. We're tired of the educated ones.
Okay, so then we'll come back to answer that. So let's go there, and then we'll answer all three. Just there, in front. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, my question is, it's really quite a simple question. And looking back at the educational infrastructure, which was what you were tasked to do we have appropriate language? Do we have adequate language for the debate? And I'll give you a very quick example. Slave master, owner, just slave master, owner, whatever, overseer. What does that word conjure? On its own, it needs to stand on its own. If you're looking at the scale of the atrocity and what's happened, if we're describing our situation, do we have appropriate language to describe it? Because to me, a slave owner, there's nothing in that. The word slave and owner, you put them together, doesn't speak to our specific condition or what happens. And that's just one example. and it's at the core. So we don't have, so I'd like to know your opinion on that, because it's just critical to all of the debate.
Absolutely, yeah. And then, thank you. And we'll take one more question, and then we'll come back for answers. And then next one.
Thank you, everyone. I want to give thanks to my elder who brought a bit of humor back into the room. We needed that. I think we had a microcosm of an expression why my generation, per se, had a break from the older generation. We've had a microcosm of that expression. We need unity. It's unacceptable that we are trying to shout over each other. Yeah, we need to find a way, even if there's been past issues between us, it's not acceptable that we are still shouting at each other, yeah? Otherwise, that's why we can't get the youth them, yeah? That's why the youth them is not interested, because we, the elders, are still shouting at each other. It has to stop. It's unacceptable, yeah? Unacceptable, yeah? We can't have that anymore, yeah? I'm saying this, yeah. So, the thing I have uncovered here is that when we're talking about our ancestors, we're either talking about the trauma, yeah, which is relevant, we have to do healing. Or when we talk about the genius, we're talking about the pyramids, yeah, per se. I'm using that, indulge me. That's very important, we need to know. But what I don't hear we say enough of is, even when they enslaved us, yeah, even when they reduced us to subhuman status or attempted to, yeah, and put us to work for free under the whip, yeah, we still created every last invention that is making our lives comfortable today. Every last invention was created by us. That's how you tangibly engage with the youth, with the young and them. If the youth can look at the traffic light, it goes green, orange, yellow. Oh, someone like me created it. If the youth is driving in a car, yeah, and you can tell the youth in the car, oh, you see the combustion that's happening in the engine, how the car is actually able to propel itself forward or backward, was created by us. Yes, I appreciate that you want me to ask a question. I don't have a question, yeah? So I will take the autonomy for me to share what I want to share, yeah? Nobody go tell me what I need to do, yeah? I appreciate you. I am sorry, yes. Sorry, my mother. Forgive me. I'm just boiling as well. Okay. I've just asked not to have. I am sorry, yes? Forgive me. I apologize. That is inappropriate. Sorry. Sorry. Forgive me, please. I've just asked not to do what I've just done. Yeah? So I am as fallible as everybody else, yeah? All I wanted to do...
I think we're going to answer the questions that have been asked just because we're pressed for time. Okay, thank you, brother. Okay, so the two questions that were asked, what provisions for community schools are in place? What plans are there? And do we have the appropriate language for reparations? Can we just have some quick answers from the panel?
We have the opportunity to host those schools. It would be amazing if we could have funding to be open on the Saturday to be able to do that. But I have thought about that, and it's something that's in mind. I'm a product of the Saturday school. So many people here are. So I understand the importance of that fundamentally, and I would love to see that continue through Black Cultural Archives. What is the second thing?
Appropriate language.
We don't have appropriate language. We're looking at our archives right now and thinking of how this history that we have is full of very problematic language. Actually, for us to be a truly transformative and radical archive, which is what we are committed to be doing, we have to create language to reframe even the way we interpret the archive. So no, it's a work in progress. Thank you. Let's connect.
Do we have any more responses to this? Quickly, we have to wrap up.
I know we're not going to have time to do them all, but just to say, I would love to see a supplementary Saturday school in Glasgow, and there have been attempts over the years, particularly from the Ghanaian and Nigerian communities, which have 50 years standing of community self-organization. The Ghanaians have been trying hard to create such a thing. And we had an African art center, which was organized by a Ghanaian drum master, which did a Saturday school. And I was about to donate my books to it before the landlord pulled the plug and the building had to close. And therefore, for 2 years, we've not had it. But once he gets reestablished, I'm going to help him by donating my books to the first Saturday school coming in Glasgow. I would just want to quickly say, Bernard Cord was mentioned, and he was a very important educator and activist for parents. But given the Grenadian Revolution was overthrown 40 years ago last week, and I am bishop, and therefore it's incumbent upon me to remember my ancestor, Maurice Bishop, the leader of the big revolution in the small island, whose death is still unexplained 40 years later. I also have to shout out to Sheku Bayo, and that's something I probably should have done in my opening statement, but if I'm guessing by the quizzical looks that most of you may not know that Sheku Bayo was murdered by police in 2015 in Kirkcaldy. There's a public inquiry currently going on into his death and about whether racism played a role in his death, and I always try to platform that family's struggle for justice. It's very important that the Scottish state is investigating the way its police is conducting itself towards black people, and that's a live issue for us right now. Just a question about community Pan-Africanism. There are about 150 African organizations in my city, right? Most of them formed in the last 10 or 15 years or so. To get a Pan-African understanding and attitude between them requires us to be networked properly, and that is difficult to do. Anybody in any city will tell you, newly arrived communities going through the settlement process that we went through 60, 70 years ago are struggling with all the economic consequences of trying to do that right now. The luxury of campaigning for something which is long-term, which this is, reparative justice is, it's hard for them to see beyond the immediate economic consequences. What we can do is, I think, in the language we use around reparative justice, we are having that discussion. We say enslaved now. We don't say slave and slave masters. We say traffickers, enslavers. We say enslaved Africans because slave is not a natural existence. It is a state that we've been reduced to by the actions of oppressors, and that we are people who resisted it. So by saying enslaved Africans, we are acknowledging that ancestors resisted. That's why we say that. So there's a whole load of terminology. I won't go into all of them. But I say that the practical things we can do, which is about the curriculum, I've worked with the anti-racism education in Scotland, who are black educators who've compiled a whole load of things in the last 3 years, which have been used to educate our teachers. So they've been part of the curriculum modules that they can download and use. Our education department works with Education Scotland, so we're trying to, widen that access, and I'm quite willing to take more advice from everybody here. So I'm down here. If I'm here, it's because I want that curriculum to be changed, and so I'm willing to listen to anybody who can give us good advice about where we should go, because we clearly don't have all that knowledge in Glasgow or in Scotland, and I hope that it's around this room.
That's time for the session. We have to wrap up because there's the next one. I think any further questions can probably be asked to the panel after, outside of this room, or also addressed directly to APGAR